to talk to you about respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. So just to remind you of what acidosis is a condition in which your blood becomes more acidic than it should be, meaning that it has more hydrogen ions in it, and that means that it has a lower pH. Alkalosis means that the blood is more alkaline than it should be, and that means that its pH is higher, and it also has fewer hydrogen ions, so it's more alkalotic. So the condition that we're talking about here, both conditions, are called respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis because both of these are caused by a respiratory condition. This is to distinguish it from another condition that we'll be talking about later, not in chapter 23, but later in another chapter, called metabolic acidosis. And metabolic acidosis is caused by a metabolic condition. So here we're talking about a respiratory condition. So let's first talk about respiratory acidosis. Again, we mentioned that it's caused by a respiratory condition. If we have hypoventilation means lower ventilation, meaning you're not breathing as much as you should be. This could be caused by perhaps pain in your ribs, causing you to have problems breathing. It could be caused by someone taking some medication that depresses the breathing center and causes you to have lower respiratory rate. And at any rate, when you don't breathe as much as you should be, you don't blow off enough CO2, so you have increased CO2 levels in your blood. When you have increased CO2, that's going to then jump into the carbonic anhydrase equation. Let's just jump back and find our equation, which is this one right here. CO2 and water, will join to make the carbonic acid, which then dissociates. Okay, so let's look at this. If we have hypoventilation, we're going to have increased CO2 because we're not able to blow it off, which gives us increased carbonic acid, which gives us increased hydrogen ions because, again, remember, carbonic acid breaks down into hydrogen ions. It will also give us more bicarbonate ions. This will then cause a decreased pH, meaning increased acidity. That's what happens when you have hypoventilation, increased CO2 levels, which will then cause a drop in pH, and that's increased acidity. That's a condition of respiratory acidosis. In respiratory alkalosis, again, it's also caused by a respiratory condition. In this case, hyperventilation means that you're breathing off CO2 more. You're breathing very rapidly. Therefore, you're breathing off a lot of CO2 more than you normally would. That would give you decreased CO2 levels. Whenever you have decreased CO2 levels, you're going to have decreased hydrogen ion levels, and then you will have an increased pH, and that also means a decreased acidity or increased alkalinity. So I'm just saying all these terms to help you remember what these things mean. CO2 is always related to the degree of acidity. The more CO2 you have in your blood over here with hypoventilation, that makes your blood more acidic. When you blow off a lot of CO2, your blood is going to be less acidic, which means the pH will go up. Okay, so that's the difference between respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. How do you treat these? Well, obviously with respiratory acidosis, you want to do everything you can to help improve ventilation and get rid of the CO2 levels. It can also be treated with fluids that would adjust the pH appropriately, but the goal would be to improve ventilation here. In respiratory alkalosis, what sometimes happens is they will have people breathe into a paper bag, um, and they can rebreathe their CO2. That will help them to then get their pH back to the normal level. Because if you breathe back your CO2, you're going to get your pH back to the level it needs to be. Okay, what are the things that control respiration? Well, we've got different areas of the brain that are involved. First of all, in the medulla oblongata, we have what's called the rhythmicity center, and this controls the rate or rhythm of respiration. Normally, within this, there's an inspiratory area that's active for about 2 seconds for inspiration, and then the inspiratory area is inactive for about 3 seconds, and that just means nothing happens, and then your body will passively exhale. That's the normal basic rhythm for respiration. However, if you have high levels of ventilation because you are exercising rapidly, or you have a great need in order to breathe rapidly, let's say you're not getting enough oxygen, this will activate the expiratory center in your medulla, and this will then stimulate your internal intercostals and your abdominal muscles to help you exhale more vigorously. Okay, also in the brain, we've got another center in the pons. Remember the pons? We have these two centers, actually, the pneumotaxic and the apneustic centers. These centers will regulate the depth of inspiration, how deep you breathe in. And then your cerebral cortex, meaning your thought processes, you can actually control your breathing. And everyone who's ever done any underwater swimming, you know that you hold your breath, and then you go down under the water and you stay under as long as you can. But you can control your breathing by not breathing in only for so long. Once your PCO2, your partial pressure of CO2, reaches critical levels in your blood, you will override your voluntary control by your cerebral cortex, and you'll have to just give in and let your medulla take over. Okay, let's look at the reflex control of breathing and what happens with changes in the hydrogen ion concentration in your CSF in your blood. So we need to think back to what happens here to cause increased hydrogen ions. We know that CO2 levels, when they increase, are going to cause increased hydrogen ions in your CSF. That increased hydrogen ions are going to stimulate, that should be an M, will stimulate the chemosensitive cells in your medulla oblongata that will cause you to have an increased respiratory rate. Now, if you have increased CO2 in your blood, that will cause increased hydrogen ions to be in your blood because of the carbonic acid equation. That increased hydrogen ions in your blood are going to stimulate these chemoreceptors in your carotid and aortic bodies. And this then the impulse will be carried to the medulla oblongata, and then the medulla oblongata will send an impulse that will increase your respiratory rate. That will make you breathe more rapidly and enable you to blow off your CO2. Okay, now it takes a large decrease in your oxygen level in order to stimulate the oxygen chemoreceptors in your carotid and aortic bodies. Once that happens, that will stimulate your medulla and cause you to have an increased rate of respiration. But the most important thing, the first and most important stimulus to your respiratory rate is your CO2 levels. Your CO2 levels, it doesn't take too much of an increase of CO2 to cause you to start to breathe more rapidly. It takes a large decrease in oxygen levels to stimulate increased rate of respiration. And this is just a picture showing you your where your chemoreceptors are in your medulla oblongata. Here, it's showing you where your the various higher centers, your cerebrum and cerebral cortex, limbic system, and hypothalamus that can have input. This is showing you your pons area where you've got your pneumotaxic and your apneustic centers. And then these here are your respiratory rhythmicity centers in your medulla oblongata here. So this is just showing you a picture of how these will go down and actually send fibers down to control your breathing by stimulating your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles here. Okay, I think this is just a diagram that's just showing you about with quiet breathing, the normal cycle of inhalation and exhalation. And again, this is more detailed than you really need to have. This is just when you have forced breathing, you need to, there needs to be a stimulation of your abdominal muscles and your internal intercostals to help you exhale more easily. This is just showing you increased, your increased CO2 levels and what that does to how do you maintain homeostasis. So I think this is just really stating again what I stated back here in writing. So the picture might help you. Some people it might help, some it might not help. Okay, this is showing you respiratory acidosis, and we're going to be getting into the compensation later. So we will hold off these compensatory mechanisms until down the road when we get to the renal system. So we won't worry about how they're compensated for. Right now, I really just want you to know the definitions of respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. But just as a sneak preview, when you have these conditions, your kidneys are going to compensate for it. Your respiratory system is going to try to compensate for it. Okay. So you will have, when you're in acidosis, you're going to breathe faster to try to blow off more CO2, and your kidneys are going to do some things to try to help get your blood pH back to normal. In respiratory alkalosis, what happens is your body will try to decrease your respiratory rate in order to help get you back into homeostasis. And your kidneys are also then going to compensate to try to get your blood back into a normal pH range. And again, this is material that we're going to be covering a little bit later in a different chapter, so you don't have to worry about that particular slide. So that's it for this chapter. Thank you for your attention.